As you're eating lunch, I wanted to welcome all of you to the Alliance for Peacebuilding and to Partners Global. As you see, we share this beautiful space. And to tell you how just honored and delighted we are to launch Mike Gijek's amazing books that you see on the table here, and I believe they're for sale for a discount. And Ambassador Dobbins and all of you. The subject is so important for peacebuilding, and it's a subject that we don't talk about often enough. We really face a challenge as peace builders of how to engage with criminal networks in the countries and regions in which we're operating. As often as we know from Mike's work, they hold real power, and yet both the kind of moral and ethical dilemmas and also the practical issues around engaging with them are very challenging and formidable. So really having enlightenment on this topic, having a toolkit that we can use is a huge advance for the field. But I also want to thank Mike for his partnership over the years. That you've been one of the key people we know who can bridge the security and corruption and peace-building divide, but also for helping to anchor our series with Rowman and Littlefield. As some of you might know, we have a peace-building series with the publisher, and having someone of Mike's stature and intellect be one of our first books in that series has really been wonderful. So I want to thank you.
Thank you.
But before I introduce Chip House, will introduce our panel, I thought we should go around the room.
And you might want to look at that, and perhaps we can talk later about it.
Thank you. And I'd like to introduce Chip House, who is AFP's Senior Fellow for Innovation and also is the lead editor for the Rowman and Littlefield series, to introduce our panel. Thank you, Chip.
Thanks, Melanie. I guess I met Mike. We seem to be in the Mike fan club today because of another part of his life, which was as an Air Force officer. For reasons that are not clear to me, I've ended up being one of the few people in the peace-building world that's comfortable talking with folks at DOD. And Mike has since gotten me interested in questions of illicit power structures or corruption more generally, where he's made me put on my political science hat as much as my peace-building hat. And it seems to me one of the great things about an event like this is that we're bringing in to our rooms people that we don't normally run into. And I think that's a very important thing as we look forward to, on our end, expanding peace building more deeply into the mainstream of governance in the U.S. and around the world. I was particularly drawn to this project, again, wearing my political science hat, because one of the things we've come to pay a lot of attention to in the last few years is this great blob called corruption, which is, as we get ready to drain the swamp, that's a term that's being thrown around with tremendous imprecision, and that includes most of the indices you can find in on measuring corruption. But I prepped myself for this session by editing my chapter on Russian politics in my comparative politics textbook on the Metro on the way in, and reminded myself of a wonderful book called The Senility of Vladimir P., which is a novel by a guy named Jeff Honig, who's actually a physician, about what happens 20 years from now when Vladimir P., who does not have a last name, of course, is in a dacha where he is senile and is dying of Alzheimer's. And it's hysterically funny. And we don't get to do much fun when we talk about this kinds of topic. So what we're going to do is Mike's going to talk about the book, and then you're going to talk a little bit, and Stefan's going to talk a little bit, and I will let Mike, you run the logistics.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Which means I can.
Hey, Mike.
Oh, yes.
Hi. I just a quick shout out from California, Dana Air here. I'm one of the chapter authors, and I just wanted to say hello to everybody in the room who I know, particularly Len and Mike, who I haven't chatted with for a while, as well as Chip.
Right.
Oh, thanks, Dan. I'm sorry I didn't recognize you as we were doing the introductions.
Right.
Thank you.
Yes, and in fact, I had intended to acknowledge your contribution, Dana, and thank you so much for reminding me that you're there. I want to start by acknowledging the absolutely critical role that Chip House played in getting this book out. The project started when Nadia and I were at USIP several years ago, quite a few years ago. By the time we were nearing completion with 2 volumes, 30 authors, 10 case studies, it took a few years, USIP went out of the book publishing business. So I was high and dry. Chip House rode to the rescue. And the amazing thing about Chip, and his interest and support, but he's an amazingly proficient guy, able to read through 600 pages of text. I even asked for help on an article that condensed this, and I only learned later that Chip was writing a book of his own at the same time. Most people, when they do a book, it's a monomania. They can only do one thing. Chip, for your dedicated and selfless support to the peace-building community, I think we owe you a round of applause. Yes, I told you I was going to embarrass you.
That's fine.
We would not be here today if it had not been for Chip. So, and Melanie, for your support. I especially appreciate your offer to talk about how to go about getting our recommendations implemented afterwards to develop. I've got my own thoughts on that I'm trying to implement, but your support and advice is, and Adam Wolf for your help in pulling this all off. I wanted to acknowledge my authors, 4 of whom are in the room, 6 of whom are on the phone. Dana is one. He's the author of Social Change Leadership Communications, a form of strategic communications. He's a sociologist, and he's done strategic communications in Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan. David Beer from Canada, the first police commissioner in MINUSTA, the UN mission in Haiti, and he was the author of our Haiti chapter. Haki Abasi from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund wrote the chapter on Civil Society Triangle, and that is a very innovative concept that he's implemented in the Western Balkans that the peace-building community, I think, should really take advantage of. Dan Bisbee is author of 2 of our chapters on Iraq, one on Nuri al-Maliki and the other on Muqtada Sadr, and he had multiple tours in Iraq from 2005 to 2008. Mark Kroger, who wrote about institutional development in the rule of law and justice field, was the senior police advisor at the UN previously, and I think the only American who's ever done that. And Oscar Vera and Karma Field were authors of 2 chapters, one on Bosnia, the very successful strategy against the third entity movement, and the author of our chapter on assessment and planning. So I'm going to stand up so I can address the slides, and Adam, if you can flip us to the next one. I want to
Get out of the way here.
Okay. You have a place there. So what's the puzzle that I was trying to solve? I want to describe how I got to this particular issue. In 2006, I was working for S4, and they would give us half a day off on Sunday, and one Sunday I decided to go on a tour with our Serbian and Bosniak interpreters. And they took us to a hole in the ground adjacent to the Sarajevo airport, which was the lifeline for that besieged city to get food and supplies into Sarajevo. And the Bosniak told us about a battle that they had been fighting where the Bosniaks were taking casualties, and they had some seriously wounded people who had to be medically evacuated through the tunnel. They got to the tunnel that we were looking at, and they were told, no, you're going to have to wait 2 hours. I said, why do we have to wait 2 hours? These people are going to die. The Serb mafia was bringing a consignment of frozen chickens in to give to the Bosnian mafia to sell at inflated prices. He said, I thought this was an ethnic conflict. There's something else going on here. And it took several years for the international community to realize that it was the parallel power structures in all 3 of those ethnic communities that were responsible for the obstructionism that they were challenged by. And S4 began calling them political criminal networks. I got to Kosovo as a strategic planner for UNMIC in 2000, where Michael and I worked together. S4 planned for spoilers, Serb, and military and police. They were totally unprepared for the KLA's campaign of ethnic cleansing, reverse ethnic cleansing against the Serbian community. But UNMIC had no idea that the KLA was using their intelligence apparatus, the SHIC, to try to eliminate their political rivals in the Kosovo Albanian community, followers of the pacifist Ibrahim Rugova. So after those two experiences, I began to wonder, is this just a Balkans phenomenon, or is this something that's more generalizable to peace missions, and now we have the term stability ops more generally? That was one puzzle, essentially, that I wanted to solve, but the more important puzzle is, what do you do about it? And so that's why we're here today, to talk about that. And really the purpose, Mark Coker has a great expression that he uses to capture really what my intent is. We need to stop reinventing the flat tire. So that's why overlook enemies of peace. So this is an overview. Four key points, 4 takeaways. Yes, criminalized power structures are the predominant source of spoiling behavior in missions. I'll have a slide in just a second, but 75% of spoilers are criminalized power structures. So yes, it's a big problem. And we chronically overlook it. We have 10 cases. On average, the international community takes 5 years to figure it out, to get the authorities and capabilities needed to orchestrate an effective strategy. You've not only worn out, you missed the golden hour, you've worn out the welcome mat. You're probably on your way. In fact, that probably has a lot to do. You remember Kofi Annan said that after 5 years, 50% of international interventions return to conflict. This is probably one of the reasons why we don't recognize the spoiler problem, and we take too long to get the means in place. We have 3 different types of, or we identify 3 different types of criminalized power structures, a type of spoiler. Irreconcilables, violent opponents that have negotiable interests, and supporters of the peace process. That's a pretty wide spectrum. One size does not fit all. You have to tailor your strategy to the type of spoiler, which is exactly what Steve Stedman was trying to get us to look at when he wrote, 20 years ago, 1997, he wrote Spoiler Problems in Peace Processes. This is the first time anybody has ever tried to follow up on his quest for a typological theory of spoiler management, but the strategies need to be tailored to the type of spoilers. Now, the good news is that there are actionable steps that we can take, and that's really what I want to talk about, and that'll be my last slide, the recommendation. The better news is that these recommendations don't require any additional funding to implement. The best news is we're actually making progress. Things are happening. So next slide, and I'll talk about that in the conclusion. So this can be a very pedantic discussion, so I'll try to not bore you with this, but it's the core concept. So the central defining characteristic of a criminalized power structure is that they seek, their quest for power is driven by, and their ability to maintain themselves in power is driven by access to illicit revenue, such as the gray economy. We call it corruption often, but whether it's smuggling activity, rent-seeking by public officials, looting of natural resources, that's a prominent source of the illicit revenue. The black economy is the other, which we call organized crime, the trafficking in humans and drugs and money laundering. Now, the one caveat that I want to make is I am not on a campaign to eliminate corruption and organized crime. In fact, that would be a gross diversion of mission assets to focus on that. We need to identify the sources of illicit revenue that are sustaining the criminalized power structure and focus on that in terms of our strategy. The illicit revenue can be a means for trying to redress grievances or a motive for acquiring power. If you're familiar with the Greed and Grievance literature, they have a big debate about that. It's both from our perspective. The thing that's most challenging in terms of illicit power structures is not identifying insurgencies as using illicit revenue, because what insurgency gets its money from legal means? It's the fact that we overlook the fact that member states of international organizations are also criminalized power structures in many cases. That's the hard part. But both are potentially criminalized power structures. Now, CPS are not on any organizational chart. It's not the formal structures of power, it's the informal patronage and clientele networks that we need to recognize. It's not the formal economy, it's the underground subterranean economic transactions, the illicit ones, and the linkages between the two that we need to recognize if we're going to mount an effective strategy. Next slide. So I mentioned that I was going to try to provide the empirical evidence that criminalized power structures are the predominant spoiler threat. Since 1990, the UN has intervened in 24 internal conflicts. 24. This slide lists 17 where criminalized power structures were a major threat, spoiler threat to the missions. The ones that are underlined are in our book. Stedman himself talked about Rwanda, Cambodia, and Angola, and in his discussion you can see that they're criminalized power structures. The Enough Project published a monograph on violent kleptocracies, a synonym for criminalized power structures, talking about Mali, South Sudan, Darfur, and the Central African Republic. That's 17. And I was in El Salvador, I was in Arache during the armed peace, they called it. I didn't see any evidence of spoilers in that conflict. We could perhaps discuss about it. But if the total is 23 and you have 17 where criminalized power structures have been your spoiler threat, that's 75%. So, you know, I'd actually have publishing an article on Agenda for Research. This would be something for us to look at. Are there any other types? What are they? But I think we can, at least additional research, could help to clarify whether, in fact, I'm correct in this assertion that when you talk about spoilers, you're really talking about criminalized power structures. There are different types, and I've mentioned they really are determined, the typology is determined by whether they support the peace process or not, whether their interests are negotiable or not, whether they use violence or not, and that yields three different types: irreconcilables, violent obstructionists, and supporters of the peace process. I've given a few examples here. Next slide. So obviously with that wide diversity of types, we need to tailor our strategy to the type. But one point, if in fact criminalized power structures obtain power on the basis of access to illicit revenue, that's their center of gravity. So all types of criminalized power structures should be attacked on the basis of depriving them of their access to illicit revenue. But after that, we need to tailor our strategy to the degree of coercion, if you will, force versus diplomacy, in terms of how we address this threat. And what we found in our empirical research, in the 10 case studies, we were looking for what worked and what doesn't work. What we discovered was that the strategy that Len and I identified in Kosovo, in Quest for Viable Peace, conflict transformation, actually is, because of its three lines of action, tailorable and amenable to addressing the three different types of criminalized power structures, which I'll explain here. So these are the three lines of effort: shaping the environment by diminishing the means and motivation for conflict. Now, in terms of irreconcilables, this is the part that's applicable to them. Their ability to use violence to oppose the peace process needs to be denied to them. However, the most effective and sustainable way to do that isn't necessarily military force. It's essential, but it's making them vulnerable to being indicted and prosecuted in court. That's the most sustainable way to go about this. It's not a matter of just the military instrument. But for violent opponents, but with negotiable interests, the most decisive line of effort is not just raising the costs for using violence, which is important, but providing more attractive, peaceful alternatives to pursue their aspirations for wealth and power. And that's the institutional development that is so critical in any peace process, but that's the one that should be in the lead for violent opponents. And finally, establishing safeguards, which are transparency and accountability, safeguards on the capacity that we're trying to develop. That line of effort is most appropriate for supporters. So it surprised me. I did not go about trying to prove or disprove the hypothesis that conflict transformation was the appropriate strategy. It just emerged as a result of the evidence that you can examine in the book. Next slide. Okay, this is the bottom line. So there are 6 things that can be done that should be done. And the first one has to do with, if you have a problem with a 5-year delay in identifying the problem and getting the capabilities you need to deal with it, maybe we should stop overlooking the problem and come prepared with proper assessment means. Now, when I was doing my research for this, I read a 2014, it was the Integrated Assessment and Planning Handbook for DPKO, and it says that the UN has no agreed methodology of determining risks for its missions. Now, maybe that's changed, and I hope Stefan Feller can tell us about that. But the point is this, there already is a methodology that can do that. It was the one that Oscar Vera and Carmen Field used in Bosnia. It's called Center of Power Analysis and Targeting, and it's about exchanges of power between those political elements that are underground and the economic sources of illicit revenue. It's not the only exchange of power, but you get the idea, identifying the nature of their structure and their networks, provides you with their vulnerable nodes, which then allows you to develop a strategy for dismantling. So that methodology is critically important. Progress. Oscar and I are already in conversations with the State Department about doing a proof of concept on COPAT, and assuming that it turns out to be a positive thing that they want to use, we certainly would like to share that with DPKO so that perhaps they could use it. It may be that the U.S. needs to be doing these assessments and then working with, as Len did when he was in the administration on Kosovo, taking the fruits of our labor to the UN to help them address these kinds of issues. It may be that the U.S. needs to take the lead in doing this kind of assessment. But this is the kind of thing I'd like to be pursuing in the future. The second critical thing is your mandates need to provide you with the mission, with the requisite authorities and capabilities. The most critical, and this is Michael Hartman's proposal, the most critical capability is hybrid justice institutions. The UN and the EU have created a false dichotomy. You have only 2 choices. You either take over executive authority, executive, legislative, judicial authority, or you do nothing but capacity building. There is an intermediate option, I call it partnership, where both internationals and locals work together in the judicial realm to address crimes against the mandate. Only that. Crimes against our mission. Judges, prosecutors, high-risk arrest police, corrections officials, from both. But the local officials need to be obviously carefully vetted, but also assiduously protected. Progress. There is a hybrid justice court in South Sudan. It's in their peace agreement. It's not being implemented, but Prince Said, the head of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has just stated that this needs to be operationalized to try to prevent the impending genocide. So that's a critically important tool. I mentioned already how important it is to sever the flow of illicit revenue, and Christie's chapter addresses this. One of the critical things is to have transparency and beneficial ownership, very important concept. A critically important capability is the governance and economic management and assistance program that was used in Liberia, where internationals were able to observe, monitor revenue generation, and then have to sign off on revenue expenditure. Great way to cut off the illicit revenue flow for a criminalized power structure. Why don't we use this in other missions when criminalized power structures are a threat? The other capability, and this is the good news story, is to use the financial tools that we've developed for organized crime and terrorism, targeted sanctions, asset seizure, money laundering in Section 311 of the Patriot Act. the global, you may not know this, someone told me about it, it was the Enough Project. The Global Magnitsky Act was just passed as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. That gives the president the authority to seize assets for corrupt officials. Criminalized power structures are corrupt officials, and those who target whistleblowers. So, which was what Magnitsky was. So that capability exists. Making accountability a priority equal to capacity building. We go into missions thinking, oh, our exit strategy is building up a police force, modernizing the security sector, and then we can get out. Well, I'm sorry, if we don't also address the fact that if in fact it's criminalized power structure, then the security sector is criminalized and politicized. Building their capacity is not the way to start. We need to rectify that first, and that's where accountability comes in. There should be international monitors and mentors in all of the accountability layers, and we should make capacity building funding contingent on progress towards benchmarks for accountability. No progress is being made here. And one of my critical concerns is the intelligence apparatus. Who in the U.S. government does reform of criminalized intelligence agencies? I don't think we have anyone, and I don't think we have even tried to develop any expertise on how to do that. I hope I can be disabused of that, and I also don't think that there are any metrics for accountability for us to use. So these are things I would like to have help with, especially because this one is the area that's lagging. This is a huge success story, accentuating criminal intelligence-led policing. Stefan Feller has done this a year ago in his police guidelines for police operations. He has published there that UN police are a criminal intelligence-led police force, and they use special operations to target spoilers. Hooray! Stefan, you've done it. But where do you go to get the capabilities that are required to implement that tremendous concept? Where do you go to get the police intelligence specialists? Where do you go to get the units that you need to be able to conduct these kinds of operations? High-risk arrest, surveillance, close protection. My answer to that question is the European Gendarmerie Force. Countries like France, French gendarmes, Italian carabinieri, highly professional. The European Gendarmerie Force exists, and they have just started working with the UN in Mali. So great progress being made. Much more needs to be done. I look forward to Stefan. I hope you're with us. We'll turn it over to you at this point. And
even if it's non-Apple. So thank you so much, Mike. Thanks for the invitation. I don't know how much, how long you want me to speak.
Well, quite frankly, Stefan, I think we'd be happy to listen to whatever you have to say. Your time is, I think, the greater constraint.
Yeah, right. But the question is also with regard to Ambassador Dobbins, because usually sometimes I'm getting lost in long-winded answers. So I just want to be knowing from when on you need to remind me that I have a limit.
Well, 10 minutes would be an ideal, but please don't be constrained.
Okay, then I'll try that in 10 minutes. And I have to say, Mike, on the one hand, I have probably listened into your presentation for the last 15 minutes. So I haven't gotten the entire thing. And I try to link up and to make a few comments from there. But let me just simply start with congratulating on your book. Because we have had quite some discussions about it. We have had quite some personal exchanges on it, and we know each other since 17 years, since Kosovo. So to have you continuing working on that issue that is so important for all of us, it needs to at least to spend me 1 minute on congratulating you and thanking you for your contribution.
Thank you.
That's one point. I will come to my business relatively quickly, but I try to bridge all the time operational requirements and strategy. So from time to time, I'm staying in strategy. And what I want to say is that with regard to what you name criminalized power structures, and you define it from the perspective of how you're looking at it, there is not so much academic research on that. So what you have done contributes to what I would name in the academic area an emerging body of discussions with regard to that. And I want to draw the attention on that this is extremely important what you have done, because I'm currently just simply reading this one. I don't know whether you can see that. It's from James Cockayne,
yes,
who is a member of the United Nations University, UNU, and many of you will know him as well, who has written on hidden power, see, the power, the strategic logic of organized crime. So I possibly start off with saying that what we know as practitioners, and what I have been trying to bring into the political and strategic discussion here in the United Nations, what we know is also now more and more supported by a body of academic research. Whether you put it into a context where I also operate, that I say, as you started off, threats to missions, that what you name criminalized power structures are beginning to become threats to missions. That is what I say since almost 4 years here, supported by the experience of all those theaters of operations that you have mentioned. I confirm that, and where I say this is not only that we talk about organized crime, for example, because we know that it's a problem in that country, and so therefore if we develop their police or assist in the development of their law enforcement, then we also need to take into account that there is a need to develop capacities in a relatively or in a pretty sophisticated area of policing. But the threat that serious and organized crime or transnational threat that serious and organized crime poses is not only a threat for that country, but it is a direct threat for the peace and security activities of the United Nations or other operations, organizations, whether it's the African Union or whether it's the European Union or others. It is a threat where, how should I say, you have congratulated me a little bit. I thank you for that. I stay with we, but for sure there's a lot of mission and vision of myself in it. I usually say that serious and organized crime in various forms collaborates, sometimes controls, sometimes actively uses, sometimes just benefits from violent extremism and international terrorism. And that what I usually said is that all that can happen on the basis of endemic corruption. And I confirm that with regard to being brief about that, with regard to all those operational areas you have been mentioning. If you look at James Cockayne's book, just for 1 second, and you look into it from that perspective, then you will even see that they can flourish on the ground of endemic corruption is not even exactly correct, but serious and organized crime in its emanations creates corruption in order to work with a weak state, maybe sometimes substitute the state, but under all circumstances going into an area that you name illicit power structures. I say that you name it illicit power structures because the question of whether it's licit or illicit, whether it's criminal or whether it's not criminal, with the exception of, for example, internationally penalized forms of crime, is something that you look at from a perspective of definition. We certainly in 193 member states of the United Nations do not have a uniform qualification of which activity is a terrorist activity and which not, for example. And terrorism is not a military problem, but it's a criminal problem as well. But the United Nations has increasingly accepted the notion that serious and organized crime, violent extremism and terrorism are posing a threat to missions and to their mandates, because they ultimately are not interested in an establishment of a sustainable peace and security that then also provides that law enforcement that then would run counter their interests. So that language you will find increasingly, including in a Security Council Resolution 2185 that we got ourselves for the first time in 2014, and a report of the Secretary General on the implementation of that Security Council resolution, and the reform of the police division as of November 2016, where for the first time we have that language in an official document, including for the first time an official document of the United Nations defining what the United Nations understand as policing. So that's perhaps already 5 minutes of those 10 minutes I've been given. But going one level below, what you said in the area of doctrine, and where you said that we have community-oriented and intelligence-led policing being defined as a part of that what we name the strategic guidance framework, yes, that is one major achievement that we have. Just to let you know on that level, that we have the policy level of that strategic guidance framework finalized as of end of 2016 with what I name an umbrella doctrine, guidelines on international policing, and 4 documents in the area of capacity building and development, operations, police command, and police administrations. That policy level is now followed by that we continue to work on handbooks, and 2 of those prioritized 6 handbooks are dealing with community-oriented policing and intelligence-led policing, and a 3rd one with what we define as monitoring, mentoring, and advising. You have been referencing to monitoring, mentoring, and advising yourself. So we continue with that logic and making clear that we have a clue for which we then later on, by the way, need the capacities, as you have mentioned as well. Whether the United Nations now already has a methodology for assessing risk, because that was the question that I came across when I was listening in. I'm not sure about that. That is still work in progress. We have been working, and I have been working for the best part of the last 4 years on that, by saying that if something is considered to be a potential threat, then the first thing that I need is a threat assessment. All police organizations know that, so organized crime threat assessments, for example, are useful and usual standard business in law enforcement organizations all over the world. But a threat assessment that then automatically also would be a risk assessment in that methodological form, to my knowledge, does not exist yet. I'm arguing for it, and for sure the emerging body of strategic guidance framework compliant handbooks will take that into consideration. Meaning also that in a reform activity of the police division that we actively pursue, there will be an effort to institutionalize a currently informal body that I have created 2.5 years ago, a team dedicated to serious and organized crime, an SOC team that is comprised out of experts that are double or triple-headed in the police division, plus gratis personnel that generously currently is being provided by the governments of Italy and Canada. And we will try to formalize in the next session of budget in the General Assembly round, in the budget discussion, to formalize that we have a serious and organized crime team in our police division to guide the strategic elements of what then needs to be done in missions. This team has, in almost every important mission, established already a unification of focal points for serious and organized crime and established a serious and organized crime focal point network that ties these missions together. We collaborate intensively with the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime, UNODC, and we collaborate intensively with Interpol in areas where our activities and their activities are that was just another device here that distracted me, where we address the same phenomena from different perspectives. Ultimately, Mike, all of these perspectives for sure need to lead to capacity building. That's very clear. And we have had many discussions about that golden hour and what needs to be done in that golden hour. You have reference to the strategic work that I have done here, but also the operational work that I have done in Kosovo. If I, in Kosovo, and Michael Hartman is a witness for that as well, have established the Kosovo Organized Crime Bureau, then you also know that I say that from the very moment on that we were able to establish it, we also began with capacity building on the side of the Kosovo Police Service. And if we would not have had capable Kosovo Police Service officers from the very first hour of this office on, we would never have been able to do covert operations at all. So capacity building must, under all circumstances, for many, many reasons, be at the center of it from the beginning on, and not only saying we need police boots on the ground so that we have a few officers, a few uniforms and boots, and we have visibility of police in the area of stabilizing and protecting civilians. We need to have capacity building on highest levels from the very first moment on in that golden hour, and you have stated it, we do not have that. Because
sometimes that takes care of itself. It may not. Shall we move on?
Well, you let him know that he froze.
Yeah, Adam, can you send him a text?
can I?
We can hear
I'm just
you.
listening. Okay, so I will try to be very, very brief in this regard, but I need to say something there. Capacity building needs to be on a sophisticated level from the first moment on, and it is not because we are not being given the necessary capacities and the specialist expertise by police contributing countries. And we need to find answers either in traditional capacity building exercises or what I have done in Kosovo, executive beginning of capacity building with an executive mandate, or a semi-executive mandate like in the Central African Republic, where we have so-called urgent temporary measures that were there from the beginning, and we were expected to conduct high-level arrests in order to say there is no impunity. And then we try to do that with those limited special operations means that we still only have. But as you mentioned, the reality of a hybrid criminal justice, as we also would have it in the Central African Republic, is a sad reality because we still do not have this special court. And part of that is, I have to regret to say, that at the beginning, when the mandate of that mission MINUSCA was formed, the government was accepting the international community's request that there would also be urgent temporary measures to be addressed and impunity of high-level spoilers of peace. And once they had us, they have actively begun to delay that process as long and as good as possible. Michael knows that, Michael Hartman knows that because even if we are able to establish a hybrid criminal justice court, without a domestic will and a political support for it, it's not going to happen at all. Because we will not be able, until today, France just recently, a few days ago I think, arrested Ramush Haradinaj on basis of that arrest warrant of the Serbian authorities once more, and again the result is instability in that area. So we see that everywhere. Without a domestic commitment to law enforcement and justice, there is no way. And so there is a lot of work still to be done. I will end there with one comment on the EGF, the European Gendarmerie Force, and the Center of Excellence for Stability Police Unit in Vicenza, and also the NATO Center of Excellence for Stability Police Units, all headquartered in Vicenza on the same compound. When I was in Brussels last time, I met the EGF commander, the commanding general, and guess what? The migration consequences in Europe will not allow any deployment of significant capacities of gendarmes or of capacities of the European Gendarmerie Force outside of the boundaries of the European Union for the next foreseeable time. That doesn't mean that we do not cooperate. We do that intensely. We do that on a strategic level. We are almost there with a memorandum of understanding with the EGF for the first time. We have modalities to deploy them now into mission areas under our umbrella. And the EGF is ready to support us with specialized teams and specialized expertise. That is something that is going to happen in Mali, and we do joint fact-finding and assessments of situations together with the EGF. So we have a cooperation with the EGF, and it's outstanding compared to that what we had before. But in terms of, how should I say, boots on the ground, the impact will be limited. And this then requires a lot of work in terms of getting robust specialized capacities on the ground. So our old discussion, Michael, in relation to what NATO named the multinational specialized units and what we then had in the European Union and ever, I'm prepared to have foreign police units with specialized expertise in the United Nations. We have the concepts for that. We have precursors for that. But we do not have the capacities and capabilities unless we are able to continue to train those who are ready to do that. The US government has done that outstandingly with regard to African capacities. Without that, in the Central African Republic, I would have no support, and I would still have from police units from African Union, MISCA remnants who would have no equipment at all. Without the support of the French and the US in terms of equipment and training, we would have nothing. But that doesn't mean that these guys are there and have a specialist expertise in community-oriented policing under robust conditions in neighborhoods like PK5 or PK12 in Bangui in order to extract the intelligence that we would need in order to come up with a threat assessment with a meaningful contribution by police. So we have a long way to go. To the American community sitting there, if I may say that on this occasion, a huge thank you. I thanked the Chinese just half an hour ago for the same thing because they support us incredibly with 2 rapidly deployable foreign police units of high quality. And we need to join all these efforts. And I would hope, I would desperately hope that the commitment of the US government to helping the United Nations through capacity building and financial aid in areas like the Central African Republic or Mali or elsewhere continues to be the case beyond this Friday. I want to be very, very clear. My nightmare would be if the support of the US would break down, because we really need you. Can I stop there for a moment?
Oh, Stefan, thank you so much. Do you have a minute or two if there are any questions?
Oh, yes.
Does anybody in the room have any questions? Maria?
Yes, hi. Nadia Grossbacher, USIP. I am wondering about the training that you said that the U.S. has provided. Can you elaborate on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, the U.S. is providing financial and organizational and manpower support to a training project for training future members of African Front Police units to be deployed in missions. So either we have already existing Front Police units that we had to rehead from former organizations and engagement of the African Union, or in due course, when we in Mali then also needed to generate Front Police units for Mali or for the Central African Republic, and the same would hold true hopefully at some point in Somalia, for example, where these units would be trained according to the standard of the United Nations. So we have training projects of the US that follow UN standards in order to build up the professional capacities, and we have equipment capacity activities of the United Nations with significant money. If everything continues to be the same way as it has been under the current government administration, I should say, then 5 members of INL are in Bangui, for example, to support us with capacity building of the Central African Republic Gendarmerie and Police. So in terms of domestic local capacity building and equipment and training of UN Front Police units, the US has a significant contribution.
Stefan, I have one quick question. You had mentioned, and you and I have discussed this in the past, that you need certain rapidly deployable specialized policing skills. What would you put at the top of the list? What's most important?
What's most important? I stay true to what I say. We need to have, from the very first day on, not only the standard capacities of the United Nations to build up a police component, and then to see the establishment of specialized capacities after 3 years beginning, but we need to have the nucleus of high-level capacity building in a mission environment from day one on. So we need high capacity, high caliber capacity builders from the very first moment on, and in a situation where we would have a semi-executive or executive mandate, there we would also need to have specialized capacities like highly mobile Front Police units with equipment state-of-the-art. I will be in Liberia in a few weeks, and I will see the communication equipment and the drones of the Chinese, for example, in their Front Police unit. We need state-of-the-art, robust capacities that also are able to generate the necessary intelligence. We spoke about that, whether you name it multinational specialized unit, or you name it an IPU with specialized elements in the European Union language, or you name it a Front Police unit with a SWAT capacity and an intelligence gathering capacity in the United Nations context. We have the concepts, and we harmonize these concepts step by step, but we need to live up to that task by having these units. So slowly, step by step, we get these units. The Chinese are trailblazing.
Well, Michael Hartman has a question.
Stefan, greetings. On what you just said, I would emphasize, for example, in Afghanistan with the new National Anti-Corruption Court, you have the UK's NCA, National Crime Agency. You even have a few people from SIGAR dealing with anti-corruption from the policing detection aspect. And this is where, for example, the United Nations, whether through DPKO, DPA, or through the agency's funds, would be very, very helpful. The second last thing, you mentioned that you're working on a handbook regarding mentors. This would be very, very interesting to us because while obviously UNAMA does not have an executive or even semi-executive mandate, especially for prosecutors mentoring the anti-corruption prosecutors, which we are being asked to do. It is very important that we have, if you will, an SOP or handbook that lays out exactly what the roles are. And one last point on that. It's necessary that the book indicate the role and limits of the mentors, because one of the political attacks will be the international mentors are telling the Afghan prosecutors what to do. So if there is MOUs and in the handbook specific rules on this, this would be helpful, and we would suggest perhaps that offline bilaterally we work with you. We could use what you're doing with the mentor handbook and perhaps make it go further into the rule of law area. Over.
Michael, thank you so much, and greetings back first. My understanding is, if I read it the right way in the preparatory documents, that you're not with UNAMA any longer, or you are still?
Swan song last month and a half.
All right. Okay. So not because my answer would be different, but your ability to implement that answer. On the Afghanistan issue, yes, I would definitely agree with that. A specialist expertise on a high level would need to be integrated into the police component of UNAMA. I can only advise. This is a special political mission under the leadership of the Department for Political Affairs, and Afghanistan is one of those notorious places where the international community have failed to be coherent, to be very, very polite. I wouldn't argue for that the United Nations police capacity needs to be another part in this incoherent particle zoo, but that we have high caliber expertise and advice that we could give. That for sure. My view is, my understanding is that police commissioner or senior police advisor, I had a video conference with him just, I think, 2 weeks ago, is from India. He has a profound regional understanding of the situation, and my view is also that he is quite strategic. So whenever that mission would be ready to have more advice, we will try to generate it. That's one thing. On the monitoring, mentoring, and advising, these handbooks are aiming to be ready by July 2017. Including that handbook on monitoring, mentoring, and advising. 2 of these handbooks will have a 0 version by the end of this month, and if I'm not entirely mistaken, it's about intelligence-led policing and monitoring, mentoring, and advising that I will see the first products. The methodology with which we develop these handbooks follows the same methodology with which we have developed the policy level. Brightest, largest participation of missions, of academics, of practitioners, of whoever wants to be there in order to literally to integrate the knowledge of the world and the wisdom of missions into these handbooks. So there is automatically already a link to UNAMA, because we connect to all peacekeeping operations and special political missions on the development of these, and we have working groups ongoing. If you need off the record a little hint or whatever, I mean, it's very easy to plug you in a coordinated way, because also the US is plugged in the development of these 6 handbooks.
I'm looking at the screen
Yeah.
that only I can see.
Yeah.
It says we have 15 minutes,
Right.
and I'm not sure if we are being kicked out of this room or not. So.
Yeah. Well, I should thank you, Stefan. You've always been extremely forward-looking in your views, going back to the days when you were the Deputy Police Commissioner there in Kosovo and instituted intelligence-led policing back in 2000, 2002. And I am most gratified that, and I hope that our efforts in the volumes that we've just produced can reinforce and support your efforts and your leadership. And thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today.
Michael, you're most welcome. Congratulations again. Greetings to all in the room. I think I have forgotten that. And I hope that I see you for a cup of coffee at some point here or in Washington.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye-bye. I'm hanging up here, right? Okay.
Bye.
Okay. Ambassador, it feels to me like we're in kind of a West Balkans time warp here, since everyone here seems to know a lot about that part of the world that my son-in-law comes from.
Well, first of all, I found both Michael's presentation and Stefan's very encouraging. I mean, I think how far we've come from the efforts we engaged in the early 90s to come to grips with these, how far we've come intellectually and frankly organizationally. I think I was very impressed with some of the things that Stefan indicated that they have underway. I became involved in the peace building, peacekeeping, peace enforcement world beginning in the early 90s, first with Somalia and then Haiti and then Bosnia and Kosovo and finally Afghanistan. And I think that by the end of the Clinton administration, which is to say by the end of the 90s, we developed a rudimentary but fairly substantial understanding of what the ingredients of a successful peace operation were. And the lessons, which unfortunately were never written down, were never institutionalized, were, first of all, you need to deploy a force that's large enough and substantial enough to deter the emergence of a violent resistance movement. In other words, you needed to drive resistance underground as a first step. Secondly, you need to assume that the indigenous institutions for security and public safety would have either been totally disintegrated as a result of the conflict or have been so discredited by reason of their behavior that they'd no longer be reliable. And that therefore the intervening authorities would need to assume responsibility for security and public order on some kind of interim basis. Thirdly, that you needed to secure buy-in and support regionally, that neighboring states, by reason of their proximity and their familial, criminal, commercial, ethnic, religious ties to the community you were trying to stabilize, had the ability to undermine your project if they chose to do so. And so they needed to be engaged and they needed to support the basic project, or at least not actively seek to undermine it. And thirdly, you needed to try to co-opt the competing power structures or patronage networks in the society into some form of nonviolent competition for wealth and power. And you needed to minimize the number of irreconcilables. The more people you identified as irreconcilable and sought to exclude, the larger your problem was going to be. There might be some who were irreconcilable, but we should try to minimize that. Now, you know, the Bush administration came in and essentially comprehensively ignored all of these lessons, the first in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. They didn't deploy forces large enough to deter the emergence of violent resistance movements. They didn't assume responsibility for security or public order. They didn't secure regional buy-in for their projects. And they tried to exclude the largest and most powerful patronage networks in both of those societies comprehensively, exclusively, and permanently when they decided that they weren't going to try to co-opt the Ba'ath movement or the Taliban. They were going to try to exterminate them and permanently exclude them. And so, you know, across the board, those lessons were ignored, and the results were very disappointing, very costly efforts, which have undermined the entire consensus in this country, and I think in large parts of the West, about the viability of what is pejoratively called nation building. So I think it's encouraging that despite the general disparagement of these operations, and Donald Trump's not the first one to say he's against nation building. Not only George W. Bush say it, but President Obama has repeatedly said it. So it's encouraging to know that there is still a good deal of intellectual work and a good deal of practical field work that's taking place. And it's also encouraging to hear from Stefan that the U.S. is quietly and without a lot of fanfare supporting that in Africa.
Thank you. So, do you want to run the Q&A?
Oh, no, please go ahead, Chip.
Anybody have a question? If not, I do. Joe.
Well, remember Seymour Martin Lipset wrote a book about crime as an economic system.
Yep.
And it seems to me that every analysis of the challenge in any conflict situation has to look at how does a young man conceive of having a family, making a living. What are the opportunities in the economy? And when you describe, everything you presented, Mike, was very impressive. But I'm thinking, how do you look at the way people are going to make a living, especially in the Middle East or in Afghanistan? You can't get a job in a factory or sell insurance. There are very limited sources of income. And then especially in the Sunni-Shia conflict, you have governments that do make a lot of money on their rentier economies on oil. They can field militias and do all kinds of things, especially, the example of Jerry Bremer in Iraq is just, it's enough to make you cry. The sheer aggressive stupidity of the occupation.
This is being recorded.
Yeah. I'm retired.
Yeah, I know you're retired.
So, as one looks at a strategy and an operational approach, just trying to, I'm wondering what conclusions you've come to.
Yeah.
How do you get people to make a living?
Yes.
When you cut the quote up there.
And can I use the chair's priority and piggyback? Because I wasn't thinking of Marty Lipset's book, but I was actually thinking of Sam's countryman's Dave Kilcullen's book on, not the most recent one, but the one on deteriorating cities. And what Dave doesn't talk about, but you talked about and Mike's project talks about, I think, are building strategies that are not quick fixes, that if you want to get people to not become radicalized, whatever you want to mean by that, you have to give them an alternative. And so the question becomes for me is how do you build those longer term strategies that Mike talked about and you talked about and Stefan talked about without, in the kind of political context that we're in, where you need answers by the time this president or someone else has finished writing a tweet.
Chip?
Dana, are there?
Hi, Dana.
Good.
Yeah.
I was just gonna.
Yeah, because I think this is a really productive but incredibly challenging set of questions. Marty Lipset's work really is in many respects the foundation for the chapter in the Quest for Viable Peace that says, look, you have to think not just about corruption or illicit power structures, but about a political economy, right? And a political economy of peace and a political economy of conflict, and put that at the center. And so I think that's people are only doing two things anywhere in the world. They're either trying to make a living or they're trying to make sense of the world so they can make a living, right? And so that's why the particular chapter that I added in this around social change leadership communications, right? You're trying to help that process of sense making, but that can't be separated from that core question of how do people make a living, and that's a fundamental governor on one's ability to undercut corruption, because in illicit power structures, one person's corruption is another person's kind of way of making a living that's linked to a larger population structure, that's linked to a larger set of dynamics. So I think that's just a testimony to the requirement to push out from the focus on police and the focus on prosecution to the larger political economic system.
And let me just add on that. That is one of the critical issues. We had 4 chapters, but that's the decisive in terms of transforming the nature of the political economy. It begins with recognizing that there is a patronage network in place that means that you can only get a job if you are subservient to those who are in power. And that's a self-perpetuating cycle which leads to conflict, because those who are marginalized have no other alternative. So, and as Dana talks in his chapter about building the coalition for peace, but that has to do with providing those alternative employment opportunities, which we in our formula, in the U.S. is developing the what do we call it? The framework for a market economy. And Ambassador Tobbins, yes, indeed.
Well, I think you can frame the problem in such complex and stark terms that it becomes insoluble. And so I think you do have to remember why you're there. The purpose of a peace operation is peace. It's not development. It's not democracy. If you leave and the society is at peace with itself and its neighbors, you've accomplished the mission. We don't invade countries to make them democratic. We don't invade countries to make them rich. And the UN doesn't deploy forces to countries for those purposes. They employ forces in countries that are violent in order to make them peaceful. And so how much, the degree to which you have to solve these problems is the degree that you need to co-opt competing patronage networks into some form, essentially, of non-violent rent seeking. You don't have to stop the rent seeking. You just have to stop them killing each other in order to pursue it. The objective, if you're not trying to make country X the most developed country in its region. You're trying to make it just like the other countries that aren't in civil war. And so if Liberia or Sierra Leone just goes to the norm in West Africa of countries that aren't in civil war, you've largely succeeded in the purpose of your mission. And so I think if you scale back your ambition to the point of how much of this do we actually have to succeed doing in order to leave behind a society that's going to not revert to civil war, that's the question. And that gives a somewhat more modest set of objectives.
Should we take these last three, 4, and then together and let Mike and the others respond?
So this actually falls down well with what we've been discussing. When I was in Bergen province and doing monitoring and evaluation of the Australian PRT, we used primarily household survey data, very detailed survey, and we cross-referenced results to test our hypotheses. And one of the results we got was that 80% of the respondents who said yes, coffee farming is their major source of income, also responded positively to the question, do you find the district and provincial governments legitimate? And my team leader thought that was an odd correlation, but my explanation to him was, well, if it's working for you, you don't want to rock the boat. You like the status quo if it's enabling you to have your coffee farm. So when you're making an actionable recommendation, when you get those kinds of results, what would you suggest be done if the people you're trying to build the capacity of in the district and provincial governments and even higher level are also very much participatory in illicit activity?
So let's take this last bunch together and then we'll let you respond.
So perfectly honest, it's more of a statement that I'm curious for responses to rather than a question, because I can't think of a way to frame it otherwise. But even though worked on the civil society side in the book, as Mike said, a lot of what I do for GFI, we have to do with the illicit finance. So when you talk about scale, it's for us zooming out to the 30,000 foot level and seeing the financial mechanisms that allow the money to move all around the globe and facilitates corruption. It facilitates the any kind of criminalized power structure, because to some extent, a lot of them, they're not just power structures, they're criminalized power conglomerates. We're working at GFI on a new paper on the value of transnational crime, and we're looking at about 10 or so different markets. And one of the things we see is how much different groups are expanding into various crimes. You have, for example, drug trafficking organizations in Mexico who are now also getting into smuggling oil, in part because they're getting pressure on the drugs, so oil is another way for them to make money, it's another way for them to launder some of their proceeds, but also the pipelines were already going through their territories, so they have that proximity. And you're always going to have situations like that, and even if you were to deal with if you were to map out where the bad actors and you deal with one set, another set can still come in if you still have an environment in which they're able to abuse the system and move their money. And to deal with that, the book talks about the policing, the prosecution, and ultimately what you need for all of that is you need the evidence.
Yeah,
and if you can't follow the money because you don't have sufficient records of who's ultimately the owner of it, the person who's benefiting from that money, you're never going to have that evidence. And that evidence can be a lot more powerful from the prosecution side and a lot harder to argue than some of the actual crimes they're committing. And one of our favorite examples actually is from here in the U.S. and how they dealt with Al Capone on a tax evasion charge. That was how they finally got him. And ultimately, if we're going to be successful in combating these structures, combating some of these crimes like drugs, it's the money, it's not the drugs.
Right.
To kind of continue on the economic portion of the discussion and how to address peaceful and nonviolent alternatives for kind of to gain the spoils of these groups, so to speak. Mike kind of discussed in your presentation about actors in terms of combating criminalized power structures. We mentioned like UNDPKO, UNPOL, just these actors on the ground that are trying to build capacity to help counter these criminalized power structures, or at least alleviate them to some degree. In terms of the economic side, to my understanding, the peacekeeping operations of the UN and the UN police are there to help provide jobs for the local populace. So I want to know, in terms of actors, how is UNPOL or UN organizations or national governments supposed to cooperate with either UN agencies that can provide economic development or any type of international entity, whether they're government or non-governmental, to provide these economic alternatives to people to gain something? Because as you said before, people often need a job, but they're don't have many options. So criminalized power structures may be their option to gain income. What's like kind of the plan for actors to help alleviate this issue, so to speak, or to cooperate with
Michael Hartman has something to say about that when we get to. I think there was one. Was there one more question? Yeah.
So one quick observation, Mike. In our chapter on accountability, we cover some of the issues. I know that this book series is focused on the peacekeeping environment. I think there's some interesting lessons, though, from situations where there's not UN involvement, which might be some tools that would be worthy of follow-up explanation. So I spent a good bit of time in Ukraine over the last year, and they're working on trying to create some accountability measures, institutions, and some of it even has overlap with intelligence like policing. So it's something you and I can talk offline more about. But I would encourage, if other people have non-peacekeeping environments that can inform this, perhaps to share it with Michael.
Yeah.
And lastly, Ambassador Dobbins, you've been a voice of reason for many years. I know you're plugged in across the aisle. If there's any signs of hope that you could give us for the next 4 years from your discussions and your circulation, I would welcome it.
Why don't you two finish and then we'll wrap?
Well, sir, would you? That's a great question.
Yeah, I'm probably as worried as anyone.
My wife.
But as I said, I think the sort of instinctive resistance to commitment peacekeeping, nation building. You know, it's not new. I mean, this is a phenomenon that's gone on for a while, and yet quietly, there's been a lot of positive support from the U.S. Despite that. Whether that'll continue or not, I don't know. I mean, I think certainly some of the appointments that Trump has made are people who are knowledgeable and heavily invested in, at least in the large American operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, but have some familiarity and some sympathy for the kinds of instruments and questions, particularly some of the issues you're specifically dealing with here. That is the intersection between corruption, drug trafficking, for instance, in Afghanistan, and terrorism and resistance. I do think that there are that one thing is sort of anti-corruption and good governance, and the other is peace building. The two intersect, but they're not coincident. I think Mike's presentation today and his book makes a clear distinction between criminal networks that oppose your mandate and are actively working against it, criminal networks that are indifferent to your mandate and are not working for or against it, and criminal networks that actually support your mandate and are prepared to collaborate with you. The KLA being one, for instance, in Kosovo. And you do need to treat those differently, not in an undifferentiated fashion. And the same is probably true for the counter-narcotics efforts in Afghanistan. Probably most of the traffickers are indifferent to your project. A few of them are actively collaborating with you because they're government officials and they see you every day and they're collaborating. They're also part of the network. And then some of them, the Taliban and those who are supporting them, are operating against you. And you do have to make some invidious and difficult choices about where you're going to put your resources and how you're going to prosecute, and the degree to which anti-narcotics becomes a major focus of your campaign. We did a big study in RAND looking for the Defense Department, looking at the whole counter-narcotics effort in Afghanistan about 3 years ago. And what we discovered was that despite hundreds of millions, maybe billions of dollars of effort, we had done absolutely nothing to curb drug trafficking, but that we had created a successful avenue for curbing and prosecuting terrorism, because the legal framework made it a lot easier to put somebody in jail for drug trafficking than it did for insurgency. And since many people were doing both, it became a very efficient tool. And so the counter-narcotics efforts tended to concentrate on people who were both smuggling narcotics and, conducting an insurgency. And so those are the kinds of, invidious and difficult choices that you need to make in some of these circumstances.
Last word, Mike?
Well, Christie's point, and I think you just endorsed it, but Carlos Castrosana, the head of CSIG in Guatemala, who was extremely successful, and Oscar Vera in his planning and assessment and planning methodology, basically it's an assessment of where is the legal vulnerability, as you were just saying. If it's terrorism, that's one thing. If it's drug trafficking, it's another. Where is it easier? Which law makes it easier, and which venue makes it easier to gain the conviction, but against whom? As I said previously, it's not trying to eradicate organized crime and corruption, which is an impossible task, which is one of the concerns I have about the UN's emphasis on special and organized crime across the board. If they are being confronted by spoilers who are in power because of their access to illicit revenue, it's that revenue and their legal vulnerability that we need to understand and then target that, not necessarily to dismantle their networks if they're irreconcilable, yes, but we don't know that. So we need to use both force and diplomacy, which is to say, provide them with more attractive alternatives to do it in a different way. I just wanted to thank you and Alliance for Peace Building, Ambassador Dobbins, for your consummate wisdom and for being here with us to support our efforts. I hope to repay all of your kindness by continuing to pursue the implementation of these recommendations, and I'll be getting back to you. I will keep you posted, by the way. I'll send you periodic emails about our progress.
And I want to thank you all for coming. I don't think I need to tell you you should buy Mike's book, but as some of you also know, Lynn Wells, he and I about 5 years ago both stumbled on the term wicked problem, which comes out of the urban planning world. And as I define them, wicked problems are problems whose causes and consequences are so intertwined that you can't solve them separately, quickly, or easily if you can solve them at all. And as I work with Lynn on what he's trying to do now, he's trying to solve everything all at once in one huge project, which, given Lynn's energy, he might be able to pull off. But what I like so much about this book is that it says, okay, we can't solve every wicked problem all at once right now by Thursday or Friday, but what we can do is begin, if you unravel this piece of the problem, what then can happen that is of value, whose then benefits can ripple out to the rest of society, a question I think we might all want to think about between now and Friday. Thank you, Mike, for coming. I didn't say that. Thank you.